We recently held a webinar to discuss what recovery from the global pandemic might look like. Our panel of experts shared their insights with regards to what they are seeing in the market, focusing specifically on key concerns of business as we exit lockdown, the culture of rescue in the context of changes to the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill, and building financial fortitude.
So good morning and welcome to the seventh in our series of weekly webinars. My name is Paul Slevin, and today the Quantuma team is adopting a slightly different format to our previous webinars. Today is more of a conversational style, and as the country is eased out of lockdown, we continue this series by sharing our insights with regards to what we are seeing in the current marketplace. During the webinar today, we will share our thoughts on the culture of rescue in the context of the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill and its application, and consider building financial fortitude, what appears to be the new buzzword, the practical considerations and steps businesses should be taking as lockdown restrictions are eased and we get ready for the so-called bounce back. So let me introduce the team today. Very pleased to have Carl Jackson, who is the firm's founding partner and Quantuma's managing partner. Carl has, it says, a dual role, I suspect multiple roles, but let's talk about the dual role for the moment, which is an appointment-taking partner in restructuring, as well as being the leader of our firm. Highly regarded insolvency practitioner, recognised by his professional peers as the go-to expert for businesses seeking turnaround, refinancing, restructuring, and insolvency. Thanks for joining us, Carl.
Thank you and good morning.
Also this morning we have Louise Durkan, who I seem to meet more regularly on webinars than I do actually face-to-face, even though we're only 50 miles apart. Louise is our financial advisory partner at Quantuma in Bristol. Louise has over 20 years experience of working with a wide range of clients, including multinational corporates, private equity, mid-market owned managed businesses, and charity. Good morning, Louise.
Morning, Paul. Here we are again.
Indeed. Before we ask Louise and Carl to share their wisdom with us, it's important that we listen to our audience too. So throughout this session this morning, we're going to ask you to submit your questions, comments and themes for discussion through the Q&A panel. Okay, please don't use the chat panel, use the Q&A panel. We will work to address as many of these as possible as we can during our discussion. If we don't answer your question specifically, it may be because we've aggregated that into a wider theme. If there are detailed questions that we cannot get to this morning, we will endeavour to respond to you directly. So please don't post questions as anonymous. Do leave your name so we can get back to you with a response. Actively contribute. It's important that we hear what your views are and what your concerns are, and we'll do our best to address those as we proceed. Important also to say now, if I may, that what you're going to hear this morning is not formal advice. If you are seeking formal advice, please do go back to your local Quantuma office and speak to an appropriate contact there. All the details available on quantuma.com. So, to get your minds tuned in to the process, because you're going to work as hard as we are on this one, so to get your minds tuned in, I'm going to ask you to respond to a couple of questions. So, on your screens, if not now, but very shortly, there will appear a series of questions. So 3 questions in total. Don't panic, it's not an exam. And we're just going to ask you to select the ones that are important. So if we look at question 1, what do we think the key concerns of businesses are as they exit lockdown and get back to work? Is it about people? Is it about the financial viability of the business? Is it about the viability of the core of the business? Does the business actually work? There are some statements around which says if you had a good business before the pandemic, you will have a good business afterwards. Is that true? And then is there a longer term view which says maybe the strategic direction of that business needs to change? So please have a look at those 4 and select which you think are appropriate. Then moving to question 2. And this one's in respect of the Act, the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill, which is eagerly anticipated and much work done in the background. And this is about its application and the changes of the new reforms. Again, looking at the moratorium, looking at restructuring plan, and looking at the temporary measures. And then finally, question 3, what do we think from a sectoral point of view are going to be the ones that will bounce back? Is it retail and food and beverage? Manufacturing, energy, life sciences, healthcare, the financial services sector, the all-important technology, media and telecom sector that we've relied on so heavily for the last 12 weeks? or the logistics sector. So as you finish working on those, our team will now collate those results, and we will come back to that. So once Carl and Louise have shared their wisdom with us, we will come back to those results just to see what the collective view of the wider audience is. Again, as I said, it's important that you participate in this. I see we're getting some questions through already. Thank you very much, Larry, for that one. It's important you participate, so please put your questions on the Q&A panel. Those questions that were submitted beforehand will also be responded to, so we have a list of those here, and we will be addressing those as we get to it. So on the theme of what we're seeing in the market and some insight into what businesses are saying to us, can I ask Louise to tell us what you're hearing?
Yeah, morning everybody. Thanks, Paul. We do seem to spend a lot of time on Zoom calls together at the moment. I suppose I was sort of reflecting a little yesterday evening in preparation for this morning's conversation and looking back to the last time that you and I presented on a webinar similar to this, which was back in April, 8 weeks ago actually, where we did our first webinar, which looked at businesses and the critical decision making they will have to make at that point in time. And I was just sort of reflecting, where has that taken businesses, the position that they were at 8 weeks ago, where are they now? Some of the things that we were talking about then, how relevant do they remain? How important do some of the things that we were highlighting at that point, remain for businesses today? And we started our thinking initially around businesses' reaction to what was happening globally and looking at sort of crisis management and what goes into a crisis management plan. We talked a lot about cash and funding being pretty important and critical to businesses. We also discussed things around stakeholder management and communications and how important that was within the business at that point in time. And we also were flagging, even at that stage, that businesses needed to be thinking about their exit planning and their exit strategy already, whilst they may still be in the midst of just addressing the crisis. They still need to have one eye on what it was going to look like as things moved forward. And I guess I've heard a lot of discussion in the debate about how that sort of that analysis has been broken down across businesses. We've heard a lot about people looking at the different stages of reaction and recovery to the crisis and how businesses have been responding to that. And yes, we've been addressing the crisis, the practical realities of it, and ideally people have been using the skills that we suggested around the crisis management and allocating roles to individuals within the businesses, ensuring that they had those responsibilities. But that crisis management plan now is changing. It will have changed over time. You may be on version 10 or 11 of that particular plan. But that plan now needs to become your recovery plan. So the elements that went into it are probably very, very similar. You're still looking around people, operations, finance, suppliers, etc. But you're looking at it from a very different perspective. And what I'd say is a mindset change in terms of how you deal with that and how that planning is embedded within the business. The focus probably initially was very sort of crisis focused, contingency focused, very inward thinking around what you were having to do within the business. We're now looking at it being much more market facing, much more scenario driven, and reinventing potentially your business and your business model. So it does mean that some of the people that were involved in developing those plans, may still be the right people for you to be engaging with and discussing with in terms of your recovery plan, but you may need some fresh thinking within that particular team, if you've got a team of people, if you're lucky enough to have a team of people to work on it. But certainly some different elements coming into this now as it's much more focused on the future. It's not quite normal what we're heading into. It's a period of transition, I would say, for many businesses where we are still not in that stable state, but having to change and transition the business in some way, shape or form. And it's looking at what you and your clients and your customers might value. What are the threats to your business? What continue to be the threats to your business? But what are the key relationships and capabilities and the assets that are important to you within that organisation? And what can you do? What's the positive steps that you can bring forward in terms of change? And I guess it's sort of adapting that plan, but still the key elements, obviously, within every single business remains cash. I think we used the word so many times last time around, it probably became a little bit frustrating for people, but cash is so important. Many businesses we know have had the benefit, in some cases, of grants. They may have had some loan funding that's been provided either through bounce back loans or through the Sybil's loans, so that some cash may have come into the businesses. We know that some are still falling through the cracks, and there is some additional grant funding coming through. In fact, this week, applications were open for some discretionary funding through local authorities and councils, which some businesses may now also be trying to get their hands on. So I appreciate that maybe not everybody's had everything that they wanted, but there has been some opportunity for businesses to look at what is available in terms of immediate support. And if they would, following the sort of suggestions of the regular reviews of their forecast, the regular reviews of their cash manning, daily, weekly updates, and still managing and monitoring that work still continues. That's a pretty key element of any business right now. And then looking at, I guess, sort of assessing the quality of the management information that's coming through overall. We talked a little bit about ensuring you had the right information available to you to make the decisions that you needed to make. And if you didn't have that information, to make sure that you could access it. And I suppose what the other thing that we were sort of reflecting on 8 weeks ago is the kinds of things that you might be starting to look at in terms of improvements to the business. While there was a period of sort of lower levels of activity, it didn't mean that there had to be no activity at all. And we talked about sort of reviews of control processes. We talked a little bit about reviewing your supplier relationships, looking at the diversification on your supplier base, and also looking similarly along your customer base to see whether there was any room for improvement around that specifically. Also looking at technology, whether there was any technologies that you could embrace, whether there was things that you'd always wanted to do, hadn't had the opportunity to, but actually now were fairly critical in terms of what you needed to implement within the business. So we discussed a lot of those different sort of, I guess, routes through to exit. And a lot of that remains the same in terms of the advice that we're giving. Businesses have got some real practical issues that they're facing. And this week in particular, I think what's on the top of a lot of people's agenda is just shaping the business and the people within the business. I think the majority of businesses that we're dealing with have used the furlough scheme. I think that's probably been the most universally adopted bit of support that's been out there. But we know there's changes coming. Whilst there's been an extension to it, it's not going to look and feel the same as it has done until now. And I know that there's been a little bit of discussion around this in the last couple of days, but we've had a bit of a crunch point this week for businesses where there's the cut-off in terms of getting individuals into the furlough scheme in the first place. So we had a cut-off on Wednesday. For people that hadn't been furloughed, if you needed them to be furloughed or have the benefit of that moving forward, those people had to be put into the scheme at that point. And also with the changes that are coming through in the job retention scheme in terms of the tapering system that's going to be brought in August, we know that in the next few days, if businesses are contemplating any kind of shape change that is going to result in redundancies because of the periods required for consultation, they're going to have to start making efforts towards consultation. And I think we're looking at probably Monday of next week for businesses where there may be a sizable number of, more than 100 in terms of redundancies for where there's smaller amounts. So we're looking at slightly shorter period, 30-day period of consultation. But right now, that's the biggest problem for many businesses is looking at the shape of it but also the people that it needs within that business. And what you're trying to avoid is having the wrong people in the wrong place at the wrong time, as far as the business is concerned, coming out into the open again. So I think the key questions around people is what's the work they're going to be doing? What does that workforce look like? And where are they going to be working? Are they going to be working at home? Are they going to be working in an office, in a factory, in a bigger setting? And knowing that is going to actually then influence the kinds of costs that businesses are going to be facing to bring that to life. And I think we've all seen and heard a variety of descriptions around, the social distancing issue for certain buildings and certain workplaces. There's other environments where simply, they haven't got the space available to them. The addition of sort of screening and plastic screenings provides additional personal safety, and PPE has been, at the top of a lot of people's agenda. And all of that, of course, translates into costs coming back into the business. So it's a constant cycle of shaping, reshaping and reacting and flowing that back through your cash flow to understand what is the available cash in the business, and how much cash do you actually need to get that business back out into the open world. And I think the keys to success that we were talking about was, yes, sadly, cash and how that plays through, but having those plans and refreshing them continually, and looking to see how much, of that you can implement in a short space of time. You're looking at short-term issues, short-term decisions, but you cannot lose sight of the longer term here, even though we don't really know what's yet to come further down the line.
Thanks, Louise. I guess there's some opinions around which, and some interesting feedback that I've picked up over the last couple of weeks, is that the quality of management information is leaving companies more and more vulnerable because they're not actually sure what's happening in their business. If they see output on the shipping dock, that's fine, the business is being successful. But actually understanding what's going on in the business, there seems to be a real challenge around the education of that and the implementation of good management information systems. But it's true also, isn't it, that all of the stimuli put in place by governments and local authorities have effectively masked the problem that we're now facing in respect of real cash that's available.
Yeah, and I think there's been some, I've had some conversations with businesses that you're right in terms of the quality of the information. Maybe either wasn't there or wasn't great to begin with. And in some cases where they did have information coming through, it's whether it's still relevant. A lot of the sort of there will be some basic KPIs that businesses have that they're absolutely still relevant, but you can't always see through some of the numbers that are coming through to see where that really translates to, on the shop floor, so to speak. And I think one of the discussions that we've had is around sort of revisiting the information that you do have, looking at it. Is it helpful? Is it helping you answer the questions that you need to answer? Is there other data that you can collect, and other information that you can gather reasonably easily? Again, there's some practical barriers for people here, that they don't have everybody in the organisation that they used to have. They may have furloughed a number of people that know where certain bits of information sit on the system, for example, and how to extract that information, so that that if it is there, can they even get hold of it in the first place?
Yeah, and I think just drawing a link between that and what Carl's going to cover, I think for some businesses we're facing this perfect storm, aren't we? Which is the people coming back to work, so furlough tails away. There's a rent day due in mid-September. HMRC deferrals, CBIL repayments, bounce back repayments, and the potential of invoice discounting challenges in the sense that those ledgers have timed out. Businesses will be looking for working capital, and that to me appears to be the big crux of the issue that we're going to face over the next 8 to 10 weeks. And I guess, Carl, that's why there's a lot of work going into this corporate insolvency and governance bill, which is currently wending its way through Parliament and the Lords to get royal assent later this month. given what we know today and the likely potential cliff edges that business is going to face, can you just give us some practical information, some practical insight into the context of how this could be applied, what it means for businesses?
Good morning, everyone. And thanks, Louise. Some very useful insight there. I mean, I absolutely echo everything you've said. It's an often used phrase, and I've used it for the entirety of my business life, but cash is king. And there's never a better time to actually make sure that when you wake up in the morning running your SME business or running your accounting practice, to make sure you're on top of that. You know, just a couple of other points to add before I do my piece. I think management information, it's never been more important to have up-to-date, regular management information as a sort of practicing restructuring professional for far too long. I think one of our constant issues that we have when we're advising financially distressed businesses is the inability to get decent management information out of the company. And we're often saying to directors, what you need to do is to forecast properly on a regular basis, and in particular cash flow forecasts. And I'm often met with the expression, we don't need to do that, we feel comfortable, it just sort of happens. Well, actually, in this environment, it won't happen. Forecasting is critical going forward, and actually not just forecasting once, but actually regularly updating your forecasts on a day-by-day basis, because there is such a huge amount of uncertainty out there. Really, no one knows, certainly in some sectors, when there's going to be some form of bounce back. Anyway, look, my task this morning is to, as you rightly say, Paul, canter through the corporate insolvency and governance bill, bit of a mouthful that. And for those who know me on this webinar, it's not going to be hugely technical, and I know that there are a number of lawyers on this call who probably know more than I do. But it's actually quite an exciting bill, and it's been in play now for probably a month or so. The purpose of the bill is to give aid, if you like, not only to financially distressed businesses, but all corporates. And there's an element of the bill which talks about filing accounts and relaxation of filing accounts, and actually the note that there is a relaxation on general meetings and AGMs. I'm not going to talk about that this morning. What I'm going to concentrate on are the provisions within that bill that actually hopefully will come to some assistance in terms of the financially distressed businesses. I think where we are in terms of the bill, it's had its second reading in Parliament. I think it's now gone to committee stage. It still needs to receive royal assent, but from what I can gather, we're looking at the end of June, early July, when it will become effectively statute. So it is still subject to some changes. So whatever I say, and as Paul rightly says, please don't take this as gospel. My feeling on the bill and the draft legislation that we've seen, it's not going to change radically. And I think the core principles that I'll cover off briefly will remain. So I'm going to focus on the insolvency side. In fairness, some parts of the bill have been in the planning for a couple of years, but have been accelerated as a result of the COVID issues that we've all sadly had to deal with as businesses, and in some cases personally, over the last 3 months or so. So there are some permanent aspects to this bill. And there are also some temporary measures that the bill will introduce, which will be relevant for the next 2 or 3 months. So there are sort of 5 key areas. One is the moratorium process, which I'll cover in a little bit of detail. Secondly, a sort of restructuring plan, which is an updated scheme of arrangement, which I'll cover off briefly. Some interesting provisions, changes to provisions in terms of supplier termination clauses. And then lastly, I'll just cover very briefly winding up petitions, stat demands, and also wrongful trading. So the moratorium is a brand new restructuring tool that, as an insolvency practitioner and restructuring professional, we can now we'll be adding to our tool bag. The purpose of the moratorium is to see if a business which has struggled financially because of COVID can survive. And when I say business, I mean company. This is a tool which will hopefully enable a company to survive. The moratorium, as it would suggest, is actually a period of time where the management team are given an initial period of 20 days whereby no creditor, whether that's unsecured or indeed a secured creditor, can take any action against the company to enforce their debt. During that initial period of 20 days, and it can be extended by a further 20 days by way of court sanction, or indeed, if they get creditor approval, can be extended up to a maximum of a year. The purpose of that moratorium is to enable the directors to effectively come up with some form of turnaround plan without the threat of action being taken against them. And that plan can take any form. It could be a refinance, it could be some form of informal compromise with creditors, or indeed actually an exit from a moratorium could be a CVA, if it was felt that the CVA achieved the survival of the company. It's been much talked about for probably 2 or 3 years. It's actually more akin to a Chapter 11 process in the US, which again some of you on this call might be familiar with. And it also involves effectively the use of a monitor, which will be an insolvency practitioner. The monitor, unlike an administrator, will not be in control of the business. During the moratorium, the directors will be in complete control, albeit the monitor will have the ability to make sure that the objectives of that moratorium are being achieved, i.e. the survival of the company. The monitor in the first instance has to give some credence or credibility to whether the objectives will be achieved, and throughout the moratorium period we'll be monitoring the business to make sure actually that the directors are actually doing the right things. Much talk has been had about the role of the monitor, the liabilities of the monitor as an IP. I think there are a number of unanswered questions at the moment. I know that in terms of feedback on the bill, I think R3 have raised a number of questions, and I hope that by the time the bill becomes statute, some of those questions will have been answered. I think practically, I think it could be a very, very useful tool for that previously very viable business or very viable company that had few financial difficulties, but because of COVID-19 has just hit the buffers. I think the danger of moratorium is that those businesses which were previously unviable could latch on to the moratorium as just another attempt to effectively kick the can down the road. And that's one of the challenges of a monitor, is to make sure that the reasons for entering into a moratorium period are right, and that there are genuine prospects that the company can survive. I've had an increasing number of telephone calls over the last 2 or 3 weeks from work referrers, and indeed direct from distressed businesses who are genuinely looking at this as a potential tool to avoid entering into any form of insolvency, such as liquidation and administration. So I have no doubt that actually, if used correctly, this could be a very useful part of our toolkit, and actually could be a way out of a real problem that ordinarily the company wouldn't be able to achieve, and would have had to gone into insolvency, either liquidation or administration. So that's the moratorium, and we look forward to working with distressed businesses. I think that as the months progress, there'll be no doubt attacks on moratoriums and on monitors. So I think, as ever, case law will play a major part in terms of actually cementing the moratorium and cementing the actions of the directors within that moratorium period, and also the monitor. But nevertheless, and for those of you who were around in 1986 when the new Insolvency Act, or the Insolvency Act came in, there were similar concerns expressed about administrations. So we just have to go through that pain. But I, as a restructuring professional and someone who is absolutely fully bought into turnaround, I can actually see some real benefits for the moratorium going forward. Moving swiftly on, the restructuring plan, I won't cover in too much detail. It's effectively an updated scheme of arrangement. I think ideally it's for more complex, larger businesses. Again, the purpose of the restructuring plan is to create more of a debtor-led restructuring plan. It's more akin, again, to provisions within Chapter 11 of the US provisions. And again, I support what is within the restructuring plan. The final sort of permanent provision within the new bill or the new act is this thing called supplier termination clauses. Ordinarily, when a company enters into any form of insolvency, whether that's liquidation or administration, there are contracts which will have effectively insolvency clauses in there, which enables the supplier to terminate supply of a product or a service to a company. What this bill will say is that those termination clauses will no longer be relevant. And what that means is that, and it's not just relevant as far as a moratorium is concerned, but for any insolvency procedure, whether that's administration, a CVA, or a liquidation, is that those suppliers will be under an obligation to continue to supply where they have a contract for services. I think that's quite a controversial provision. There are some conditions. It won't apply to any supplier or provider of services who have a turnover of 10.1 million. I'm not too sure where they got the 0.1 from, or indeed where their balance sheet has net assets of less than, I think it's 5.2 million. So it does actually carve out quite a large slug of SME world, but nevertheless is quite controversial. And in terms of policing that, I think will be quite interesting. I sat on a TMA restructuring panel last week where there was much debate about that particular termination clause and as to whether in reality, whether suppliers will abide by that. So that will be an interesting one to follow. But again, as a restructuring professional and where we have traded businesses within administration, that could be very, very helpful in terms of rescuing the business. So I, again, welcome that provision, although I think practically will be quite difficult to get some suppliers to follow that through. I'll just cover off very briefly the temporary measures that have been brought in by the bill. Again, I think most people on this call will have heard about these already. They've been debated and discussed for probably the last couple of months. There will be a temporary prohibition on winding up petitions not only being issued but also being continued with. I think as and when the bill becomes an act, that is for the period from, I think, the 27th of April through to the 30th of June, or possibly to the end of the month after when the bill is becomes statute. That's both stat demands and winding up petitions. It's only temporary, and the reason behind that is that it's to help, again, those businesses who haven't been able to pay off liabilities because of the COVID issues that they've encountered over the last few months. So again, I welcome that. I think in reality, whilst that's not become statute yet, whilst I'm not particularly familiar with the stats in terms of petitions, I would imagine that most winding up petitions that were contemplated have been effectively put on the shelf because there's been knowledge that this is going to come in. And the sort of final temporary measure is, again, something that's been well talked about, wrongful trading. Wrongful trading is something that as restructuring professionals and insolvency practitioners, when we're sat across a desk with a director or a board of directors, we always advise them about the risks of wrongful trading and the personal liability implications where a business continues to trade on without having full confidence that it can trade out of its difficulties and actually the company or the financial position gets worse. Well, there is now a temporary prohibition on that, so directors to an extent in this environment can relax somewhat, which again I welcome, albeit I have to say again, practically I think that could be subject to abuse, particularly with those businesses who were already struggling financially prior to COVID-19. And just to say that notwithstanding the fact that there is this temporary lifting of the wrongful trading implications, directors are still subject to Companies Act 2006 obligations and duties, and also, of course, fraudulent trading is still there in the background, and it's not been lifted at all. So look, that's a very quick canter through the bill, and as I said, it's like to become an act, I hope, very shortly. It's been much talked about. I think as a restructuring professional myself, and also as a practice, we absolutely welcome these updates. I think for the right company, and when I say the right company, it's those companies who have previously traded well, who have been viable, have good systems, good controls, but have been very sadly, badly affected by COVID-19. I do think that actually the moratorium process, the restructuring plans, and the temporary provisions that have been brought in will actually buy some time to see if actually turnarounds can happen. And as a restructuring professional, I welcome that. I would much prefer to have a project working with a board of directors where we have the ability to turn something around, as opposed to the alternative, which sadly will still happen in a number of cases, where we end up winding a business up. So I'm excited by the dare I say it, by the new law, but I'm sadly big enough and ugly enough to know that there are undoubtedly going to be challenges, and no matter how detailed the final act will become, there will be loopholes, and undoubtedly case law, and undoubtedly a number of lawyers on this call will be extremely busy over the next 12 to 18 months making challenges.
Thank you, Carl. It was interesting. I had a conversation yesterday with a referrer who has a client who is above the threshold in respect of the supplier termination clauses, is above the threshold of 10.1 million. But effectively, he's got 2 customers. So if any of those run into difficulties, he has a concentration issue. And obviously the tension then creeps in about, does it have a serious detrimental effect on the health of his business? In both cases, the answer to that will be yes. So he's a bit concerned about the application of that and how that would actually happen. But we'll get to that. I understand from the team that we're broadly ready to look at the results of the poll. I've had a slight preview, and the first set of responses is going to bring the whole thing into stark relief for us, I believe. So we asked you what are the critical issues about getting back. Future strategic direction, 27%, viability of the core business, 33%, but the overall winner, if ever, is financial fortitude. So the viability of the business, does it have sufficient capacity financially to be able to survive? Quite a high response rate on all of those. Louise, any comments from the point of view of what you've heard?
No, in the sense of that's what we kind of expected, and I guess it does reflect. Sadly, I know it is a bit of a cliched phrase, but around cash, and the sort of the day-to-day management and maintenance of the business is clearly, the key, and probably in many cases, the only question that people are looking at on a day-to-day basis. And it's all those things that we've already talked about, how you address that, how you forecast it, the quality of the information, all of that helps you understand the viability of the business in the immediate short term and the mid to longer term. So, that doesn't surprise me. We've got a bit of a leading question potentially, but it's interesting to see that People is following not too far behind in terms of the second item on everybody's agenda, which again I'd agree with is pretty top of most people's minds at the moment.
Yeah, the people issue will be a big issue because there's fear about going back to work, there's fear about safety, there's being skeptical about it, or cynical about it. There's the comfort of furlough versus going back to work. There's the use of public transport. How do I get to work? So there's lots of people issues in there. But that financial viability piece reinforces everything that you said earlier. I think one of the big questions around at the moment is that cash collection through this period. If you listen to the banks and the ABLs, they're all saying that cash collection has been pretty poor. So at some stage, somebody has to take the cork out of the dam and let things flow. I mean, have we any insight into what's going to happen? Because, at some stage, the guy at the end of the line needs cash in order to supply the goods to the bloke up the line, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a natural chain reaction. How does a small business address that immediate cash requirement?
It's incredibly challenging. I mean, only in the last few days, a business I'm advising, there's email flow from a particular supplier that's chasing down payment, and the amount of it is £600. And clearly that £600 is very, very important to in terms of the credit control on the other end. And there's a genuine debate within the business that I'm advising as to whether they should be paying some or all of that. And it's it's getting back to that basic of well, it isn't necessarily the amount that we're talking about. It's the overall principle of who are you paying, how much are you paying, and the critical suppliers within your supply base that you need to ensure that your business can continue to function. And businesses are having to look at it at that level of detail, unfortunately. And they themselves are equally chasing down and trying to collect in cash. And it's not easy at all. And I think you've already mentioned the issue around those that have got any kind of form of invoice discounting or factoring on their ledger. The ability to draw down on that as well is going to be impacted at this point in time, because there just won't be the availability within that facility if funds aren't flowing through. So it continues to be a challenge. Who blinks first? I'm not entirely sure any business really wants to be the one to do so.
Yeah, true. Okay, can we have question 2, please? A response to question 2. Carl, this is going to take some input from you. So temporary measures, restructuring plan and moratorium. Any surprises there?
No, I mean, I'm not at all surprised, actually, and I'm not surprised that temporary measures have sort of come on top, the top of the list, if you like. I thought actually moratorium might have been slightly ahead of restructuring plan, because I can probably see more moratoriums in SME world happening than I can restructuring plans, which I think, as I mentioned earlier on, are probably more likely for the larger corporate and more complex corporate, where there are effectively many different stakeholders. But I think, as I said, I think the temporary measures are welcomed. I think to an extent, winding up petitions and stat demands, they've sort of been put on hold now anyway, despite the fact that we haven't as yet had the Act come into being. And wrongful trading for the responsible director, I think is absolutely the right thing. My worry, again, I'm repeating it, is that actually that's going to be subject to some sort of abuse by, as they say within the Insolvency Act, those delinquent directors who have deliberately continued to trade, knowing full well they would never actually manage to trade out of the position. So we do welcome it, but I think what the temporary measures and certainly wrongful trading implications, it does now require more judgment. How does a director, and it's very difficult, isn't it, for all the reasons that Louise said earlier on. In reality, we can't look round corners. For those distressed sectors. And there are many of them. How do they really know when their business is going to come back? That is so difficult. And those are the conversations that I'm having with distressed or financially distressed businesses, in terms of cash flow forecasting. In reality, that's, well, how do I know what it's going to be like in July or August or next October? I mean, all I can say to them is actually you've just got to plan on a day-by-day basis and forecast on a weekly or monthly basis. But, to take that back to wrongful trading, what wrongful trading is doing is sort of allowing directors to continue to trade, knowing that actually in the short term, the financial position is probably getting worse. So I sort of welcome that, because actually how on earth can a business, a previously viable business, continue without taking that risk? But it's subject to a huge amount of judgment. But as I say, I'm not surprised by those stats at all. I'd like to think actually the moratorium will have a leading part to play. I think advisors, Quantuma, other restructuring firms will dip their toe in the water, will be slightly wary when they first implement or become a monitor of their first moratorium. But that was the same, as I said, going back to 1986 when we first took on our first administration. But I think we'll soon get used to it. Again, subject to, I think, very significant judgment if you're acting as a monitor. You know, how do you know as a monitor whether the financial information that you're being given by the directors to demonstrate that the company is viable stands up to scrutiny? It's very difficult. And again, I think judgment will be key to this, and common sense and business acumen.
I know there's a debate going on about whether a monitor can then get involved in a formal proceeding should that monitor, should that business not survive the moratorium period. And there's a theme running through some of the questions about the fact that, you know, can this moratorium period be used to prepare a business for pre-packs?
Right. So, I mean, a moratorium, I think, should only be used where there is a genuine prospect of the company surviving. Okay. And I say the company as opposed to the business. And so I don't think, or I don't believe that any directors taking advice from people like me should be contemplating using the moratorium as a precursor to a pre-pack administration. Nevertheless, and the way I read the legislation at the moment, there's nothing to stop a company from going into a moratorium. For whatever reason it doesn't work, they could, I think, still exit via a pre-pack administration if actually the moratorium hasn't worked and they've not been successful in achieving a turnaround of the company.
Yeah, and as you say, we can't look around corners, so there's no guarantee that the moratorium is actually going to produce a viable business at the end of it anyway, because the market is changing so quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, can we look at question 3, please? So this is a response to the sectors. And if I just go back to the first question that we were asked this morning, Larry, I am going to cover the hospitality sector separately, if I may. So it's not necessarily consciously left off, but it is a theme that we will pick up in a couple of minutes. Most likely to bounce back. Technology, media, telecoms, that's to be expected, I guess, given the high dependency that we have on that now. Logistics, which, you know, runs from food and beverage and shopping and home deliveries and the such like. Healthcare. So I guess there are no surprises in there.
No. I think we all sort of doesn't really necessarily matter what size of business that you're advising. We are advising businesses right across the spectrum in terms of sectors, and I think it probably broadly reflects what we're seeing in terms of the businesses that we're talking to. So again, no, not a lot of huge surprises within that. I mean, there is a view, I guess, that some specifics within certain sectors, even, for example, we've got retail food and beverage are fairly low down on the list, that there's going to be some exceptions to the rule within that, where there are businesses that have been able to adapt and pivot, which is another buzzword, and have sort of evolved from a restaurant chain into a takeaway, for example. So there will still be some successes within that, but I think overall, in terms of the challenges within that particular sector, that's probably one of the ones that we're seeing hardest hit right now. I mean, you've only got to look at the headlines over the last few weeks in terms of, businesses that are contemplating a CVA or businesses that have entered into administration falling within that particular sector. So it's pretty clear in terms of what we're seeing in front of us right now.
I suppose the one that shocks me there is the energy recovery.
Yeah.
I would have thought energy would have been a high, or is that a prediction of the fact that manufacturing is going to go up, so the energy utilization is going to reduce?
I'm not
sure I understand what that one is.
In terms of where it sits, I don't know. I mean, it's not one that I have to say that I've focused particularly heavily on. But yeah, it's another unusual one maybe within that. It's slightly less optimism.
I mean, certain sectors, Paul, it's going to be driven by consumer confidence. I mean, certainly retail, F&B. Once obviously the rate of viruses or infections are going down, which is great news. But even when we get to a stage where that's at a low level and the R factor is well below 1, I think it's going to take many, many months before we actually see consumers going back into retail, going back into pubs, clubs, restaurants, etc. Even when we come out of lockdown. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, anecdotally, I go for a morning walk every morning, and I was sauntering down my lane this morning, and I live next door to an orthopaedic surgeon who was just driving to her hospital, and she stopped and observing the 2-meter distancing rule. She sort of wound down the window. We had a chat for 5 minutes, and she actually said, and we've all heard about it in the news, that she's very confident that there'll be an anecdote or a vaccine which will become available in the next couple of months. And she was very, very confident about that. Now, I'm not saying you heard it here, but the introduction of a vaccine in July or August or September, the impact of that could be massive in terms of consumer confidence. And actually, we talk about how quickly is the economy going to bounce back, and my own view, I think it's probably shared by a number, is it ain't going to bounce back that quickly. But something like the introduction of a vaccine could have a massive impact on consumer confidence and could provide a massive fillip in terms of some of these sectors. I'm stating the obvious, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that leads me to the next point. The big debates that are going on all around the country at the moment is around the seasonal hospitality sectors. At the moment, under current recommendations, potentially facing a season of 3 winters between now and early March of next year. What have we learned so far, and have we any insight into potential solutions around those businesses? If you're running a hotel or you're running a restaurant, what's likely to be the best case for them?
Do you want to go first, Louise, or?
I don't. I have no preference either way. I think we're seeing different reactions in different ways. I guess in terms of the market generally, if we're looking at hospitality and hotels, for example, there's, in terms of opening back up, I know that there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes in many businesses looking to see how they get open and up and running. Of course, there's the continuation of practical restrictions on people travelling and what they're doing. So the use of hotels probably more for business purposes rather than pleasure in the short term, in terms of holidays and the like, is probably more realistic, which tends to lead itself to suggest that, what are people really going to be looking for out of that at the moment in terms of the consumer? They're probably just going to be looking for a bed for the night, perhaps, in the immediate short term, because they do need accommodation. Are they really going to be looking at going to some of the more sort of luxury end of the market, where you're looking to go for your mini spa break, where you're sort of in close quarters with people in the gym or in the spa facilities that the hotels offer? So I think in terms of the consumer confidence element of it, or the need for that is probably one factor within it in terms of how that market is likely to respond. And I think that whilst we are sort of all no doubt keen and eager to get back to life as normal, I don't think any of us necessarily are sort of chomping at the bit to be back in confined spaces with others, and there's a whole impact around social distancing where there's no certainty over transmission of infection rates and the like. So we are going to be looking at that particular sector for some time in terms of how it reacts and responds, and some of them in terms of the practical changes that they would need to make within the building. How can that actually roll out? If they've got outdoor spaces, great, but not everybody has that facility within their structure and within their building. So I think there's going to be some sort of separation across the market. in terms of, you know, maybe the lower budget end will fare better in the short term, because, you know, they can, you can get to your room and get up for your appointment the next day relatively easily. You're not spending too long in common areas, perhaps.
It'll be the last sector to get back to normal, without doubt. And again, I repeat what I said. It's about consumer confidence on the one side, and it's about strength of balance sheets and cash in connection with those F&B businesses and retail businesses on the other side. And, you know, go back to what Louise was saying at the beginning of this, for those businesses who've managed their cash well, who've taken cost out, who've preserved well, then they'll come out of this, albeit damaged, but come out of it. For those businesses that haven't, they won't survive. Sadly, we were as a restructuring business running a small hotel chain prior to COVID in administration, and we pretty rapidly took the decision to effectively stop trading that hotel chain as COVID hit. I mean, it was a poor time of the year to trade hotels anyway, and we mothballed them. But, you know, we've taken the decision quite recently that actually we're not going to reopen. It's too much of a risk. And the hotels that within this group are just really not the sort of hotel where you can practice proper social distancing. So we've just taken the view we'll shut them, which we have done permanently, and we'll sell them as effectively empty properties, which is a shame, but that's the reality. And for viable hotels, you know, who aren't able to abide by the likely rules that will remain in place, then I fear for them in terms of actually them being able to continue. I mean, without being a doomsayer, you know, we are absolutely focused on turnaround and restructuring and helping viable businesses. And I'm confident that with the right tools in place, they will be able to help and work with these businesses. But on the other hand, there will be undoubtedly a spike of insolvencies and failures, very sadly. And I don't say that with a grin on my face, because I would much rather work with a viable business and turn it around than actually just act as a corporate undertaker. But sadly, there are going to be there's going to be a raft or a spike of insolvencies, which I think will kick off certainly sometime in September, not beyond. It's quite interesting, Paul. You mentioned at the outset about the September quarter date. Well, don't forget we've got a June quarter date coming up. The end of this.
Exactly. Yeah,
absolutely true. I'm ahead of myself in the calendar, and I think just to bring in, there's another theme that started to come through in the questions, which is, and it's back on the agenda because we start to ease ourselves out of the current pandemic, which is the issues around Brexit. And, you know, are we anticipating another ramp up of that insolvency number that you talk about, Carl? Are we anticipating that's going to kick in March or April of next year as businesses try and cope with the tail end of a pandemic, or maybe not even the tail end, maybe still a current pandemic and Brexit on top of it?
It's quite interesting. I think the one plus of and blimey, there are hardly any pluses or not any pluses of coronavirus either. But I suppose what I can say, it's been quite a relief not to hear the word Brexit over the last 3 months. Albeit you wouldn't have wanted to replace the word coronavirus. Yes, I think the Brexit issues are still very much with us, and I think, as you rightly said, I think towards the back end of this calendar year, I think we'll see some implications there in terms of distress caused by Brexit, without doubt. And again, I'm having conversations with businesses where actually Brexit will become a problem for them. Add that on to coronavirus, and it's the perfect storm, isn't it? It's not gone away.
No, I fear it's going to be painful. Okay, we have run out of time. That's all we have time for this morning. Just remember that what you've heard today is not formal advice, and if you are looking for more formal advice, please do go to quantuma.com, where you will find a list of our partners and directors and their contact details and the relevant offices close to you. so that you can have that conversation with them. Thank you to everybody who's joined. It's been a huge crowd this morning, and we're very grateful for your time. We hope that you've gained something from that. There are some specific questions around which we will try and get back to you on, which we just haven't had time to address this morning. So thank you indeed for taking part and your participation. So join us again next Friday. We'll be back about the same time, and this time we'll be talking about the retail sector. And Andrew and Brian, joined by David Amberson from Cedar Dean and Vernon Dennis from Howard Kenny, as they see what's happening within the food and beverage and the retail sectors. So that's next Friday at 9:30, June the 19th. Thank you again, Carl. Thank you for your contribution and your valuable time this morning. The same to you, Louise. Thank you for the Quantuma team in the background for making all of this happen. I know it's been a challenge with the polls and the various things going on. Very much appreciate your support. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a lovely day, and please stay safe.
You can find out more about how we are advising businesses at this time on our website.